The white liberal is the one who has perfected the art of posing as the Negro's friend and benefactor. In this political football game, the white liberal is able to use the Negro as a pawn or a weapon.
And the other one was in the New York Police Department material on surveillance of Muslims. It says one of the indicators that a Muslim is radicalizing is that they give up smoking cigarettes, right? So I say to everyone who's Muslim, if you live in New York, keep smoking. Right? It's for you to keep smoking those cigarettes, actually.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Black Radicals. In this episode, we're going to be in conversation with Arun Kundnani, who's an author and anti-racist activist. In this episode, we're going to be talking specifically about his book, What is Antiracism and Why it Means Anticapitalism? And hopefully we're trying to delve into these questions a little bit more deeply. The reason why we've chosen to invite Arun Kundnani and him graciously agreeing to come into the podcast is because his book is the one that we started off at the Black Radicals reading circles. And I can honestly say for myself and for the people who've read the book, it has been a meaningful read. It's very thought-provoking. And I can say that it has shaped our political decisions and activism in major ways, actually. So I would highly recommend picking up the book. And if you would like to be part of the reading circles, the Black Radicals reading circles, please do get in touch. We have an Instagram page, which is black_radicals, or you can get in contact with us directly through email, which is blackradicalsgermany@gmail.com. So blackradicalsgermany is one word @gmail.com. With that, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I certainly did. And if you have any friends or family who might be interested in this conversation, please do share. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And hopefully we can continue to bring you interesting guests. So stay tuned and enjoy the show. Good evening. Welcome everyone to the second episode of the Black Radicals. Today we have a very special guest. And as we were just speaking before the recording, this guest's book, which is What is Antiracism and Why it Means Anticapitalism, is the first book that the Black Radicals have chosen for the reading circles. So it's kind of surreal and very, very, very cool that you're here to do this interview with us, Arun Kundnani. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Mohammed. And I appreciate that you've been reading the book and that it's hopefully been of some use for your struggles in Germany, and especially as it's not in the German language. So maybe even more a challenge. But that's great that you've engaged with it.
Yeah. I mean, just on that note, I think the book was very, very accessible. And, like you said, there's some of the comrades have English as their second language, and even they were like, this book was very, very, very accessible to them, and it was very interesting and stuff like this. So highly recommend. And with that, I think we get started. So just for a brief background, maybe you can add some details that I've missed. But Arun Kundnani is an activist academic who's worked on anti-racism and published multiple articles and has written many books. And I think the ones that I'm familiar with is the book that we're going to talk about today, which is What is Antiracism and Why Racism Still Matters. And there's a small book that you've written that trying to sort of get a thing, which is this one. Yeah, but I think it's more... Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just more of an introduction, if you want to speak about this a little bit more.
Yeah, there's a little book called Homeland Security Myths and Monsters, which I guess came out a couple of years ago. I worked on it with a graphic artist. So it's a visual book. It's, I wrote the words, but mostly it's an art book. where we tried to tell the story of the Department of Homeland Security in the United States. That was a nice kind of fun project. But yeah, if you're looking for a kind of rigorous, sort of sustained intellectual argument, then it's going to be somewhere else. But that's a nice way of just using visual images to talk about the question of homeland security in the United States.
Yeah.
By the way, he said I'm an academic. I'm not really actually an academic because no university nowadays will employ me. I'm afraid I'm not really, and I feel ambiguous about it. Like, I'm not sure if I want to be an academic. In terms of the title, it'd be nice to have the regular income, but just as a matter of fact, it's been a long time since I had a job at university, so that's no longer a part of my description.
Okay. I mean, I think that there might be a story there, but
another time, maybe.
Another time. Yeah. Okay, so I think one of the things that we want to start off with is a very interesting anecdote that you sort of start the book with, and I believe it was at the beginning of your book where you start talking about Supermax. I mean, before, a little bit later, about Supermax prisons, and before that, you start talking about how, for example, certain Holocaust memorial kind of adjacent buildings, or one building that was used and then reused, that was used to be like sort of a memorial building, where the only thing that was on offer in regards to race was somewhat a little bit inadequate. Maybe you can get into that, and how sort of the other side of it was a prison for racialized people. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yes. So there is a place in the Netherlands called Vught, and Vught was built by the Nazis as a concentration camp. So it was a place where various categories of people were imprisoned by the Nazis: political prisoners, activists, communists, and Jews, the largest group, who were held there. The Jews were held there after the kind of process of rounding up every Jewish family in Netherlands began really around 1943. And they were held in Vught temporarily before being sent on to the other camps in Germany and Poland, where they would have been killed in the gas chambers. That's that in the Netherlands, that is a place that is understood within that history of the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands and the genocide of Jews. And so on part of the site where the prison was built by the Nazis, there is a memorial center, and you can go in there, and in this memorial center, they've reconstructed some of the buildings from the camp, and they give you some of the history of the Nazi occupation of Europe and so on. And then in the last part of it, there's a sort of reflection room where you're invited to think about how this history is relevant for today. And there's some very limited attempts to say, well, what this means for today, and they present the argument that really it's about intolerance and prejudice. And so, if we want to prevent this stuff from happening again, then we should make sure as much as possible that we can educate ourselves out of our unfounded prejudices. And they give us some examples, including prejudices against a white person who has tattoos, and prejudices against a blonde woman who might seem stupid because she's blonde, or some ideas like that. So prejudice can affect every group in this way, right? So what is not mentioned in at all, if you visit this place today, is that most of the site of the original Nazi concentration camp remains a functioning prison. And so actually, as you enter the museum, if you look to the left, you can actually see the functioning prison, the main entrance. And when I visited that, you look over, and I was ignorant of of this until I investigated it more. But you look over to the left and you see that there's a line there of women queuing up to visit people inside the prison, and they're wearing hijabs and niqab. So you understand that, okay, there seems to be something about this prison where there's Muslim prisoners. And so I did some more research, and it turns out that within Vught, there is what they call a Muslim detention center where they hold people who are accused of terrorism, accused of being Islamic extremists, and so on, and where they apply methods of imprisonment that have been imported from the United States, from the supermax prisons in the United States, solitary confinement, so that you have no human contact. You're confined to your cell, strip searches, CCTV cameras that constantly monitor you, and so on, right? So this very extreme form of incarceration that comes from these so-called supermax prisons in the United States. And in the book, I kind of look at the history of where this comes from in the United States. And when you look at that, you begin to understand that it is a response to the Black radical movements that were operating in prisons in various ways from the 1950s onwards, and that these were methods of controlling prison rebellions. And there's some other interesting things about Vught. One other thing is that one of the people who was imprisoned at Vught by the Nazis is someone called Anton de Kom, who was a Surinamese anti-colonial revolutionary kind of figure, who was active in the 1930s in Suriname before he proved too troublesome for the Dutch colonialists. And so they sent him to Holland, where they thought he wouldn't be able to mobilize his people. And when the Nazis occupied the Netherlands, he joins the resistance. Then he himself ended up arrested, and he was imprisoned in Vught in 1943, I believe, before being transferred to a concentration camp in Germany, where he died. And so, what struck me about Vught was this is one site where you have all these different histories of racism, all tied together, right? You have the Nazi genocide of Jews. You have Dutch colonialism bringing a Black revolutionary from the Caribbean to Holland and leading to his death. You have these methods of incarceration that are applied in the War on Terror period to Muslims, using methods of control taken from the struggle of African, taken from the attempt to repel the struggle of African Americans in the United States, right? All of these different racisms layered on top of each other in that one place. And what we get from the official history in the museum is just one of those, right? We get the story of how this place was part of the genocide of Jews. There's no attempt to say, not the same thing is happening again, but you can't understand what's happening today in things like the War on Terror, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Black racism, without understanding those histories, right? And so we are told in that memorial, as you walk around this site, do not be a bystander when you see intolerance. And yet, as you walk around, you are exactly a bystander, because right next door there is a prison where Muslims are being subjected to the mental torture of extreme isolation, right? And yet no one seems to know. No one seems to be aware of this. So it was an important. I think it's telling, right? It tells us something about how we are certain kinds of racism are very visible. Certain kinds of racism are made invisible, deliberate, right? Made invisible. And partly that is because we are unclear about what we mean by racism, right? We tend to have this idea of racism, as the museum tells us, right? As a matter simply of individuals who happen to be intolerant or have certain biases and so on. Anton de Kom talked about racism in a very different way, right? For him, and I think he's absolutely right about this, Racism is a way of organizing the economy, right? Organizing the way of how resources are distributed, how different kinds of workers, different kinds of labor are distributed and organized, right? To maximize profit for capitalists, right? And to control the ability of workers to organize themselves, right? And so, again, I think just in this one site, it opens up all these questions.
Yeah, yeah. I think when I think all of us in the reading group, when we read that, it was actually kind of we were taken back. I mean, like you said, exactly right. I mean, this is a site where basically you had, the persecution of different groups under the occupation of Nazis and so on and so forth, and then literally on the scene, basically. I mean, I don't know how it looks like, but it seems to be like just literally a wall on the other side, and then you have like this other race, like basically the racialization of Muslims. And I think one important thing that you mentioned in the book as well is that the crimes that they're accused of could be as simple as a tweet or something, something so, I don't know, like it's basically just ideological criminalization, let's say, or something like this. Is not
correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And this is where, the war on terror does this, right? I mean, I feel like in the last few years, we've become quite understandably, very focused on the question of Palestine and how Zionism controls the discourse and so on and so forth. A lot of what we've seen in the last few years in terms of how Palestinians are represented, right, in mainstream media and so on, is not new at all, right, and goes back to these earlier periods, right? And war on terror is one version of that. And what happens in the war on terror in Europe and the United States in that period from 2001 to say 2017 or so, when it starts to maybe fade a little, is the idea that terrorism is the end result of what was called a process of Islamic radicalization, right? And Islamic radicalization was understood as this thing that is happening at the level of ideology, right? So in other words, the more someone seems to displaying Islamic belief, Islamic culture, Islamic behavior, the more likely they are to be a terrorist, right? And so from the point of view of the people who come up with this idea, the solution to preventing terrorism is to use mass surveillance to identify people who seem to be becoming more Muslim in their presentation, right? And so for the purpose of preventing terrorism, you have to have mass surveillance of Muslims, and any expression of solidarity with other Muslims, even in the level of speech, an expression of opinion or tweet and so on, becomes what is read in this space as the indicator of radicalization, right? So someone who posts a tweet saying, expressing solidarity with Palestinians in struggle, or Syrians in struggle, or Chechens in struggle, or Bosnians in struggle, or whatever, right? That becomes an indicator not of someone exercising their right to freedom of speech, which is supposed to be in Europe, the most important thing, but it's transformed, because you're Muslim, it's transformed into a warning sign, right? And so then you have all kinds of mechanisms whereby you can put that person maybe in prison, or maybe some other, a little bit less of a dramatic intervention to contain them in some way. If they're not a national of that country, deport them. If they are a young person, you subject them to some kind of political re-education program or whatever. Always different elements within this broader machinery. But for some people, the expression of those kinds of opinions of solidarity with other Muslims becomes itself a criminal offense that you can be imprisoned for, right? And certainly a good proportion of the people who were involved, being subjected to that regime of extreme isolation, were people like that who had simply expressed their opinions on the internet.
Yeah. I mean, this is something maybe I don't want to be too glib about it, but my wife and I are both Muslims, and both of us are practicing. She wears the hijab. It's something that we joke around sometimes, which is, I mean, both of us are practicing Muslim, and we're socialists. So in that case, it's a matter of time before the police comes and knocks through the door, and we're politically active.
Right.
But it's
yeah. I mean, these jokes are very often the way that we deal with being nervous about this stuff, right? And we use humor to manage that, right? Which is anyone who's lived in an authoritarian regime knows that this is how everyday people get through their day, right? In this situation, right? I mean, I can tell you 100 jokes because so many people in my work as an activist and a writer have shared these jokes with me. My favorite one is the in New York, the New York Police Department have had this surveillance program, right, where they target every Muslim in New York, including every restaurant and every business, right? So when you look at the eventually some of this material was released from the it was no longer classified documents, so you could see what these surveillance files looked like. And what you see is they spend a lot of time in our restaurants, right? The Pakistani restaurant, they go into the Arab restaurants, they're spending a lot of time there. They present in their country, but they will have food. Okay? So this is for, and the other one was in the New York Police Department material on surveillance of Muslims. It says one of the indicators that a Muslim is radicalizing is that they give up smoking cigarettes, right? So I say to everyone who's Muslim, if you live in New York, keep smoking. For you to keep smoking those cigarettes, actually.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, you talk about it a little bit in the book about like the surveillance, and I think it's not just New York; it's also like in the UK, for example, with the Prevent,
right,
and other places. That is specifically, I mean, they basically dedicate, if I remember correctly, then like put more resources in places that have a higher density of like Muslims, and it just purely because of that. Yeah,
absolutely.
No, I mean, we joke about it, but it really is. I don't know. I mean, it's tragic sort of humor. But from that, like maybe this is going a little bit too far into the book, but I think it links in nicely with modernization theory and the not the end of history, the clash of sort of civilizations, and so on and so forth. So can you give us a little bit of like the ideological back? I mean, I know this is like going a little bit too forward, but the ideological background about like this, why Muslims, I don't know, are specifically targeted, why these sort of radicals are in the way of like, I don't know, I suppose Western liberalism or whatever you want to call it. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I don't think it's possible to make a general theory on that question, right? I think you have to look at the particular histories in different places, right? So I think the story, so, let's say in Britain, right? Now, of course, Britain had its imperial history. So you can go back in the archives of British colonialism and look at how were colonial administrators writing about the Muslims that they governed, 200 years ago, right? What did the administrators of the British government in Sudan, right, say about the rebellions against British colonialism in Sudan at the end of the 19th century, right? You probably know better than me, right? But one of the things that you see is that they start to, in certain contexts, they start to see Islam itself as a kind of rebellious element, right? In other places, they see it as a stabilizing element, right? And so, but the important thing is that they begin to consider Islam as a factor in the question of whether their colonial rule can sustain itself, right? They start to want to know about Islam. They want to know about how Islam is practiced and how it is organized in each particular context where they are governing significant numbers of Muslims, right? So it becomes an object of, this kind of Orientalist study. That's why you have, Orientalism as a academic discipline emerging, is because they believe that knowledge will be useful for their government of these people, right? When are you going to find Muslim leaders who can serve your interests, and when are you going to find Muslim leaders who don't serve your interests? You need to have the knowledge of how, different parts of the Muslim population organize themselves, right? Mm-hmm. That's that project, right? So there's a deep structure there in British history of wanting to develop a kind of knowledge and a kind of collective institutional history around the question of Muslims, right? Same in France, same in the Netherlands, right? Which of course governed Indonesia, right? France, of course, governed Algeria and parts of Africa that were majority Muslim. Now in the United States, the picture is different, right? Well, wait, before we come to the United States, so let me say, so therefore in Britain, when you get to the situation in the second half of the 20th century where you start to get a significant number of Muslims living in Britain itself, right? The sort of governing logic of dealing with Muslims as a minority in Britain derives from the governing logic of dealing with Muslims as colonial subjects. Right? There's a continuity there because, after all, those colonial administrators in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, when they come back to Britain, they're still working in the British government. Their ideas are still circulating in the administrative space in Britain, and they're joining the local community relations council or whatever to deal with, again, the question of how do you govern Muslims, right? And it's not, in that sense, it's not a specifically Muslim thing, right? Like the same would be true of the expertise that exists on Hinduism or Sikhism and so on, right? Or the expertise that supposedly exists on, different countries in Africa and the Caribbean and so on, right? So that's a general phenomenon, right? That the moment of, we don't even say that this is a moment of immigration, because the people coming from, Trinidad, India, Pakistan, Sudan, Malaysia to Britain in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, they are actually not immigrants. They are subjects of the British Empire, made to be subjects of the British Empire against their will, who travel from one part of the imperial system to another, right? That's not immigration, because they're not coming from one separate political system, nation-state system to another nation-state system, which is what immigration is. They are moving within the same colonial space. So they are subjects of the British Empire when they leave India or wherever, and they are subjects of the British Empire when they arrive in London, right? Now, when you think about the United States, the history is very different, because the United States does not, before the 21st century, the United States has no history of governing significant numbers of Muslim peoples, right? Like direct rule over significant numbers of Muslim peoples is not a part of the United States history. There are some kind of, a significant number of enslaved Africans who were brought to the United States were Muslims, right? There's no real institutional history of the United States developing any kind of sense of knowledge and institutional arrangements specifically to deal with Muslims, right? Until you get towards the end of the 20th century, what happens is that because of the relationship between the United States and Israel, especially from the 1970s onwards, when that relationship deepens, right? The United States essentially imports into Washington, into the foreign policy establishment in Washington, it imports Israel's way of thinking about the question of Muslims, questions of Arabs, question of Palestine. And so the relationship in the United States is centered around the question of Palestine, very much so. Now, and so you see that from the late 1960s, right? That's when you start to see the first inklings of some kind of discourse in the United States around Muslims. But at that time, it's still very much focused around Arabs, Palestinians, right? Then in the early 70s, you have what people call the oil embargo, right? Where some of the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia and so on, for a few months, basically say we're suspending sale of oil to the United States, and we demand that the United States bring about some kind of settlement for the Palestinians, right? It lasts a few months, and then it's no longer operative, and the thing blows over. It doesn't do anything for the Palestinians, actually. But it sends a shockwave to the United States establishment because, this resource that is the lifeblood of the world economy and which they depend on is withheld for a period of time by a country that seems to be, a part of the third world and seems to be potentially tied to the question of Palestine. So suddenly the question of Palestine is tied in that moment to the actual sustainability of the whole capitalist economy, right? And so that is the first time that you start to see in the pages of American kind of foreign policy journals and so on, you start to see Americans start to ask these questions that European colonialists have been asking for a century or two. What does it mean when Muslims talk about Sharia? What does it mean when Muslims talk about jihad? Are these concepts that threaten us or that we can work with, right? What is the Islamic idea of how an economy should work? What is the Islamic idea of banking? And so on, right? And can these things be integrated into the system that we run and do so in a way that doesn't undermine it and doesn't threaten it? Or are these, more fundamentally antagonistic? And that becomes the debate within the foreign policy establishment. And you get the one wing that says, look, Islam is just going to always be antagonistic to the West. And so it is a question of us using our violence and our coercion to suppress that threat. And others saying, guess what? Actually, we can work with this and actually use it for our agenda. In fact, we can even mobilize some kinds of political Islam as a way of opposing our bigger enemy, which is the communists, right? And so they play these games, right? And that's the debate through the 70s, through to the 90s, right? Which is why in the 1980s, on the one hand, you have Americans saying Islam is the most dangerous thing because of the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis and so on. On the other hand, saying, actually, we can work with, these Islamic movements in Afghanistan that are fighting the Soviets, right? And in fact, we can call these people freedom fighters and invite them to the White House, right? Both Islam, but one's the good Islam, one's the bad Islam, right? Mm. Then you get to the 90s, and the Cold War is over, right? So the incentive to say we will work with Islam to tackle communism is over, right? That's done. And so the argument that Islam is the new enemy, what Samuel Huntington calls the ideal enemy, right? And he means, neoconservatives will say explicitly in their writing, the United States as a society cannot hold together unless it has some external enemy to unite against. Mm-hmm. And if the communists aren't going to be that enemy, someone else needs to be. And Huntington says, guess what? Islam is ideal for this purpose because they are racially distinct. They're a big number of people. They have a presence in the world that means that they can play that role, right? And so this is not some hidden conspiracy, right? This is pretty much out there openly as an initiative that says we have an opportunity here to present Islam in this way and it serves our goal of maintaining the coherence of our society at home and our capacity to dominate the world in the rest of the world, right? And so through the 90s, the neoconservatives make these arguments. They obviously share an agenda with Zionists, right? Who, obviously from Israel's point of view, they are dependent on US support for the viability of Israel. And they understand that that support is more likely to last in the long term if Israel can be presented as this island of Western values surrounded by a sea of dangerous fanatics, right? And so that is the narrative that they offer to the United States and that neoconservatives import and pick up, right? What they don't want is for Americans to start to think that what is happening in Palestine is a matter of, say, human rights, a military occupation. In other words, a political issue, right? A question of power and politics. What they want is for it to seem like a cultural issue, question of values. These people are just not like us. They are dangerous. They are fanatic. They're inherently violent. They're terrorists. And therefore, we cannot have a political process to settle disputes, but we have to have a violent process of suppressing them, right? That's the narrative, right? And so that is what then, with the war on terror, becomes universalized, right? And institutionalized in countless ways. And of course, leading to wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that where millions of people are needlessly killed, right? And that is the end result of, because this is a genocidal logic, right? Like all racism's taken to their extreme end in genocide, and anti-Muslim racism did that during those war on terror years. So the capacity of the US military, with its junior partners like Britain and so on, Denmark, now Denmark is supposedly standing up to the United States, but Denmark was running to be by the United States' side in Afghanistan. So, right. So the capacity of that machinery to take the lives of, large numbers of people without significant dissent in the Western heartland, without enough dissent to stop it, let's put it that way, right, was what we discovered in the war on terror. But alongside that, a whole machinery of, counterterrorism laws, administrative measures that operate in every institution, like we mentioned a moment ago, prevent policy in Britain. The striking thing about prevent, which was designed as a policy to tackle what it called Muslim what it called violent extremism. It was always understood as Muslim violent extremism, right? But it operated in every area of British life. Every point at which Muslims interacted with any kind of public body, right? Prevent was operating as a tool of surveillance and as a tool of intervening to try and shape the culture of everyday Muslims, right? So whether it was, your school, your youth club, your library, your doctor, your dentist, you see to have your eyes tested. If you go to a hospital, if you go to, if you get government funding for an arts project, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So even before you get to the question of the police, the courts, the prisons, this whole other apparatus, right? This is, the extent of it. And I think what you have to, where you end up is concluding that the purpose of it in a country like Britain was to prevent a generation of young Muslims in particular who were forming into a kind of political identity and had a certain kind of political set of demands that they, as citizens of Britain, had every right to express and to advocate for, to prevent that from being able to happen. Right. So it was essentially an attempt to suppress a group of citizens from exercising their political expression. Right. And when you do that, from the point of view of the people perpetrating that, it seems like a way of maintaining the peace and order in society, right? But for the people who live through that, it is it imposes on a community a kind of self-censorship, right? Which is always traumatizing, right? Those jokes that we were sharing earlier are actually an expression of that kind of trauma, right? Of we joke because we don't. But let me rephrase it. That when you have a group of people who are subjected to that, humor is one of the ways they deal with it, right? And that tells you that what you're dealing with is not just the ordinary way in which citizens interact with their government, but is operating on a level that's a bit more like a traumatic level, right? And so that doesn't go away, right? That doesn't go away. Part of why there is this incredible, beautiful mobilization over the last couple of years around Palestine is because it's the return of the repressed, right? It's the return of the repressed. What people couldn't do so easily in the war on terror years, now a space has opened up and upsurge comes because suddenly people feel, I cannot allow myself to do that self-censorship anymore. This one I must speak out. Right? This one I must be, and it breaks the walls a little, right? So that's what we've seen in Europe and the United States. And of course, they try and suppress it now, and not so much with these kind of soft mechanisms that they used before, like prevent. Now it's the police more, right? Now it's hard power, not soft power to control us because we've broken through a little bit of our own self-censorship, right? So now it has to be hard power. That's why they send in the police to beat us up on our demonstrations. So, right? But it's one of the reasons that this is happening is because of what we've lived through in the recent past. Right?
Absolutely.
It doesn't go away.
Absolutely. I mean, just to give like a shout out. I mean, like I think the picture here in Germany is that I don't know, German guilt is stopping people from like speaking out against Zionism and stuff like this. But I must say, being here in Germany, I have to give like a shout out to like certain like Antifa movements and like Students for Palestine and so on and so forth. They have done absolutely tremendous, and young people, tremendous work when it comes to like mobilizing for Palestine and so on and so forth. And you're absolutely right. For example, the mechanisms or the processes which they use to like suppress us. I mean, here in Baden-Württemberg, where I'm speaking to you from, they're now thinking of, I don't know if it's passed yet, but like they're now thinking of basically getting Palantir to like surveil and like help with like the police force and so on and so forth. Palantir obviously being basically an arm of fascism, in my opinion. But what you said, I think there's 2 points here that maybe you can help us understand or deconstruct. Which is the first point is you sort of gave us an overview from a structural position about how racism works. There's also the liberal notion of how maybe I don't know. I call it liberalism, and I think you in some place in the books you call it like a liberal notion of how racism works, which is not so structural, but more so like individualized, sort of it's like a psychological reflex or something like this. This is one thing, and the other thing is I think you mentioned that there is a role for us to play in the West. And if we're silent about it, things get so much worse, not just from the outside, but not just outside, the West, but also on the colloquial West, but not outside where we live, but also inside, sort of like a boomerang effect. So if you can help us understand these two things.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I suggest in the book is there's really two traditions of anti-racism, right? So one is what I call a liberal tradition, liberal anti-racism, and the other is a radical anti-racism, right? So we spoke earlier about Anton de Clon. When he's writing about racism, he's coming from the radical point of view. He sees racism as a way that resources in society are distributed in ways that some racial groups benefit and others lose out, right? And the way of organizing labor and work, and so on, for a racial division of labor. And we can get to why that is part of the history of capitalism, or why that is central to how racism works. The liberal tradition, they start from a different place. Usually, it's a reflection on Nazism, right? How did Nazism come to power? And so here I'm thinking about particular scholars like Magnus Hirschfeld and Ruth Benedict, who are writing in the 1940s, both interested in this question of the rise to power of Nazism in Germany in the 1930s, and more or less they say the same thing, which is in the 100 or so years before the Nazis come to power in the 1930s, you had scientific racism, right? So you had people who were understood as scientific experts in Europe who presented theories of racial hierarchy in the world, right? They never agreed how many races there were in the world. Sometimes it was 4, sometimes it was 7, whatever. But they all put them in a hierarchy with white people at the top, right? And so that was presented to ordinary people in Europe as a scientific account of how to understand human difference. And so that was internalized by them. It shaped their prejudices. So that then that created the conditions for a charismatic extremist politician like Hitler to come along, exploit those prejudices, and gain political power through that, and then abolish liberal democracy, right? And so in order to defend liberal democracy, it was necessary for intellectuals, scientists in the 1940s then to come out of their universities and to educate the public to say, what we told you as scientists 100 years ago has now been found to be scientifically false. There is no racial hierarchy in the human species. And so you need to abandon these beliefs, these prejudices, these attitudes that science encouraged you to hold from the past in the name of rationality, right? It's now irrational to hold these beliefs because we know them to be scientifically false, right? And so this becomes a kind of liberal project, right? The anthropologists, the biologists, various academic experts engaging in this top-down project of educating the public out of their racist attitudes, right? And this is what anti-racism is. This is an explanation for why racism exists, and this is an explanation of how we can get rid of it, right? And so this becomes the mainstream approach, right? In Europe and in the United States, I think to the present day, takes different forms over time. Today, you see it in things like unconscious bias training, right? Mm-hmm. The idea that you see the paradox. If you think about racism today, right, from the liberal point of view, right, if your liberal point of view is racism is essentially it's a belief, it's a dogma, it's something inside our heads, right? It's an attitude, right? Well, then you immediately have a problem, which is find me someone who expresses those beliefs, because most people don't, right? Mm-hmm. Like even the far right party, they say we're not racist. There's some, but most say, oh no, I'm not racist. I just think that white people should have the same rights, blah, 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 all that sort of spiel. If you look at the Trump, the Trump administration stuff where they want to ban diversity initiatives and so on and so forth, right? If you look at the executive order that is issued, it says that we're doing this in the name of racial equality, in the name of civil rights and so on and so forth, right? So everyone is an anti-racist today, right? So if you want to say that all the suffering and oppression that racialized groups experience is the result of belief, individual belief, how come you can't find any individuals who believe in it, right? I mean, maybe they're being dishonest, but like, actually, anti-racism is an official orthodoxy, right? At least in the liberal form. So it doesn't add up. So that's why then liberals say, well, okay, yes, people don't think they are racists, but unconsciously don't. Right? So unconscious bias, right? So everyone is carrying this unconscious bias, and we can use special techniques in workshops and so on to bring it out and to get rid of it. It doesn't actually work as a method, and it doesn't actually get to the core of what racism is, because racism isn't something that is about individuals who happen to have beliefs unconsciously or consciously held. You can't explain the solidity of racial oppression in our world, right? You can't explain how deep it is, how fixed it is, if you try and explain it on the level of individuals, no matter how many individuals you find, right? It's coming from something, a bigger force, right? A stronger force than just that, right? So, yeah.
Can I just interrupt and just to say an anecdote just relating to this point, which is like a lot of times, I have had conversations with like people who would say exactly that, which would be like, it's just these attitudes, and only if like these people met, I don't know, traveled more or read more or became aware, and I think one of the things one of the paradoxes that you mentioned is, for example, you just point to like a person who is, everyone agrees that's a racist, like for example, Elon Musk. I think Elon Musk has probably traveled the world. He's the richest person and he's got time to read whatever. But
Right. I mean, at this point in 2026, to think, and we've had 100 years, right, of liberal anti-racists saying, you know what, it's about education. Let's educate people better. Let's introduce them to other cultures, whether by travel or by, multicultural awareness programs and so on and so forth. Like, in Britain, since the 1960s, people from South Asia have been invited to, share our food with, to like try to change people's attitudes, introduce our culture, watch us dancing, watch us singing to try and change their attitudes, right?
Yeah.
And people love our fucking food. I dance and everything, but it's still fucking beat us up. Right, and the police still want to go after us, and immigration policy still tries to stop us from coming into these countries and so on. Right, so this history proves that this is not adequate as a solution. Right, like the 21st century has seen these things get worse. Right, and now so the If I was having this conversation with you in 25 years ago, right?
Yeah.
January 2001, right? Then I would be saying to you, in a place like London where I lived at that time, right? For someone, so when I was a teenager in the 1980s, you would be getting racial abuse on the street, in the bus, blah blah blah. Sometimes you would have to defend yourself physically, right, from attacks and so on, right?
No.
By 2001, I'm not getting that anymore, right? Mm-hmm. So we successfully defeated a certain kind of racism, right? The problem we still had was the institutional racism, the structural racism, right? The fact that people in our families were being deported or weren't being allowed into the country or were being disproportionately stopped and searched by the police and things like that, right? But walking down London, I'm less scared about an attack or abuse, right? Walking down a street. But today, actually, we've gone backwards on even that stuff, right? So something's not working, right? Something's not working. And it's not, and actually during that time, we've had more and more of the things that liberals tell us should have worked, right? Like there are more and more South Asians on British TV, being funny, being entertaining, being relatable. True. So, like Hollywood, there was a study that was done last year in terms of representation of different ethnic groups in Hollywood movies. It now reflects the American population, right? If you thought that better representation in Hollywood of the diversity of the American population was going to change attitudes and therefore change the structures of racism in the United States, that should be working right now in the United States, right? Absolutely. It ain't, right? Because that's not what racism is about. Racism, to understand, when people talk about structural racism, right? Which again is another of these phrases where everyone agrees now. Well, at least a few years ago they did, maybe different now, but at least, in 2020, when we had the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, everyone across the board would be saying, yeah, we need to tackle structural racism. We need to tackle systemic racism, right? So on some level, they're using language that suggests that they are understanding it as this deeper force, right? No. Usually no one really had a sense of what that structure was. And when you look at what they're actually doing to deal with it, they are really just saying there's a lot of individuals who need unconscious bias training. So they're still back in that paradigm. But actually, the structure in structural racism is capitalism, right? The reason that racism, it has this solidity to it, right? So that even individuals who consider themselves to be anti-racist end up having to participate in racist structures, right? Like that is because racism ultimately derives its power from the power of capitalism, from the power of the way that the economic system is organized, right? And so what you're up against when you're dealing with the question of racism is not just individuals who can be subjected to persuasion, but structures that you need to tackle with power, right? So if we're going to tackle this and actually make progress, and what we know from our histories is that the only time we've made progress is when we are able to build collective power, right? We're not trying to persuade individuals or reform individuals. We're using collective power to try and dismantle structures, institutions, right? It's a power struggle. And so what makes it difficult is we are in an age where we are not as good as 50 years ago or 100 years ago, in fact, coming together as peoples, build collective power, and then mobilize that collective power to go after the sources of our oppression. We're just not as good as we used to be, right? So that's part of what comes out of the book for me is what can we recover from our histories that helps us do that in new ways for the future.
Yeah. I mean, I think while you're talking, for example, at the regression, what you mentioned about the regression, can you hear me properly or?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can, yes.
Yeah. I think what you were talking about at the repression, for example, just to give some anecdotes, and like I remember, like a lot of in more and more in like recent years, you'd have, for example, I don't know, some of women friends who would be like, I had to like basically take off the hijab because I work late shifts at night, and if I go into the bus, I'm just going to get abused. And like this, like I have to choose one or the other. And I suppose one thing that I wanted to ask you about, which I think might be like important for us here in Germany specifically, is this discourse of liberal anti-racism. It's persistent, but the discourse is persistent in the mainstream, for example. But the discourse of like radical anti-racism, for example, it hasn't been adopted wholesale, or like hasn't been like an orthodoxy, for example, in the radical left, at least from here in Germany. And I think in the book you mentioned, I mean, maybe it is in the US as well, but from our experience here in Germany, in the book, and I think you talk about the common debates within Marxism and Marxist tradition that have sort of, I don't know, try to navigate this, sometimes unsuccessfully, other times, especially with like the colonial thinkers and stuff like that, a little bit more successful. And also why it's still persistent to this day. So for example, one of the things that you hear a lot, I'm sure this you hear in the US as well, in the UK definitely, but definitely here in Germany, is like, yeah, racism and feminism and all that kind of stuff, maybe like you put it in the back burner. We need to deal with something that's immediate right now. We can't always be talking about racism and stuff like that. And I like one of the frustrating things about this is like, bro, like, what the fuck have you ever talked about racism? Like, you know, like it's like putting in the back burner till when? You know what I mean? Like, when has this not? You know what I mean? But yeah, sorry. Maybe you can elaborate more on what you've written.
Yeah. I mean, so you know, the short answer to this is that the white left in Europe and in the United States defaults to this line of thinking that says the basic contradiction in our societies is the contradiction between workers and capitalists, and that is not a race question; that's a class question, and therefore, you know, the question of race is secondary, right? The question of gender is secondary, and of course, we oppose racism, but the real central struggle is, can we unite the working class across different races to be a strong force against capitalism? And so therefore, if we start getting too much into the question of race, then we're fracturing the unity that we want for our working classes. And so we're a bit reluctant to do that. So let's just focus on the class question. If we can move on from the race thing, you know, it's a bit of a distraction. So let's just focus on the class unity, and then that's how we win. And the more we unite as a class, use our power to oppose capitalism, the less racism there'll be anyway, because racism is really a way to divide us. That capitalists, that's the story, right? So the problem with there's a couple of problems. One is you'll notice that the theory of racism that is implied in that is actually the same as the liberal theory, right? Which is that it's really a matter of attitudes, right? And yet capitalists are trying to generate those attitudes because they want to divide workers from each other. But the sort of core of it is one group of workers has some irrational and divisive beliefs that mean that it's harder for those workers to unite with the rest of the working class, right? So what are the solutions then? Well, the approach then is that the main focus is we try and build class unity. If in the process of doing that, we come up against racial attitudes that mean that white workers don't want to unite with other workers, then we might do some one-on-one, challenging, myth busting to try and challenge their prejudices. It's a liberal approach. Right? It doesn't see racism as actually structural to capitalism, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the deeper reason why it actually is a problem is when you actually look at how class societies are organized, right? They are organized according to racial divisions of labor, right? So race is not just an ideological feature of our societies, but it's also a material feature of our societies, right?
Yeah.
In other words, it's not just about belief. It's about the fact that, take, for example, the European labor market, right? You have a working class across Europe where there is a racial division of labor between the workers who have citizenship and the workers who don't, right? What you might call undocumented workers or sans-papiers or, irregular migrants or whatever, right? But those people they are part of the working class in Europe, right? They are typically working in the most exploitative parts of the labor market. But they are subjected to a separate regime of social and political control. But that is what the border is, right? It's not, we tend to think of immigration controls as ways of stopping people from coming into a place, right? Which, of course, is what they do. But the border regime in Europe also creates a racially segregated workforce, a racially segregated working class, right? So if you talk about class unity, you have to confront the fact that you have an apartheid system in Europe, right?
Yeah.
You have an apartheid system. And so are you going to just organize the white workers in that situation? No. If you're serious about organizing the working class, you have to think about the whole picture. And if you're going to organize the workers who are racially segregated, the fundamental material reality for them, not just the ideological reality, the material reality for them is that segregation, right?
Absolutely.
They can't form a union in the same way that citizens can, because once you start doing that, will be removed and deported, right?
Yeah.
So their methods of organization are going to look different. Their experience of what it means to be a worker is going to be different, right?
Yeah.
So anyone who's an organizer, an actual labor organizer, rather than someone who's just, sitting at home imagining organizing, but actual organizers know that you have to start from where people are at and what is their experience and what are the issues that are coming up for them, what are the struggles that are going to mobilize them. And so going to those workers and imagining that their experience of being a worker is going to be the same fundamentally as the white citizen worker, and that you can just organize them in exactly the same way for exactly the same political agendas. It's just not reality, right? So what happens in practice is that the prevailing white left, to be honest, I don't even know if the main kind of it's, here we've got to be, obviously there's a lot of different organizations that we might think of in lots of different countries and so on, if we're talking about Europe as a whole. Certainly a trend, let's say, is that the main left-wing organizations in Europe have gentrified themselves, so that what they in fact do is no longer, they might talk about the working class, but I'm not sure they have any real efforts to organize the working class, white or black or anything else, right? Mm-hmm. What they tend to do nowadays is two things. One is they attract in the cities college graduates who are downwardly mobile, college graduates who are expected to have more comfortable professional jobs and so on, finding that they aren't able to have that. And those are people who become a base for left-wing politics, right? Plus, racialized groups who are not organized by those left-wing parties anymore, but who become bases for those left-wing parties through the mediators of community leaders, right? So there's a kind of politics of representation there, whereby a community leader can say, well, in this neighborhood, I'm a gateway to hundreds of people in my particular ethnic group. And so I bring you those people to your left-wing organization as a base, right? So they're not being organized, they're being brokered, right? Yeah. So that is, I think, to be honest, sadly, that is what a lot of left-wing politics looks like in Europe today. To the extent that there's still like trade unions and that kind of labor organizing, they are based in predominantly the assumption is that the undocumented workers, the migrant workers and so on cannot be easily organized. Mm-hmm. And so they are abandoned, right? What happens is that those people then have various community mobilizations that operate on the basis of a shared ethnicity or shared experience of racialization, then on which they organize, which then the white left says, oh, it's identity politics.
Yeah.
Right? No. Whereas it is actually precisely the mode of organization that responds to the material conditions they're in, because what they're dealing with is a racial segregation. Right now. So of course they organize on the basis of race. Right? But it's also an anti-capitalist mobilization, because to the extent that they try and challenge that part of the material reality of capitalism, they're also fighting capitalists. Okay. And ultimately, they're creating the space for ways of coordinating their struggles with struggles of other workers.
Well, right.
And to be honest, the reality is that most of the most kind of innovative forms of collective worker organization in Europe, I think in the United States today, come from migrant communities. Right? If you look right now in the United States, it was the Somalis who were the first to organize against Amazon in Amazon warehouses and start to win. Right? They would, it's the Latino and Somali immigrant communities who are fighting back against ICE using collective action, right, against these immigration raids, which is not just about immigration, it's a class struggle as well, right? Because they are, in fighting against ICE, they're fighting against one of the most powerful mechanisms of class power over workers, which is the ability that the ruling class has to remove from the country a significant section of workers if they want to. Right? That's capitalist power over workers, immigration control, power to deport someone, right? Yeah. So fighting back against that and disabling that power is a class struggle as well as an anti-racist struggle, right? Too often the white left just dismisses it as, oh, that's just identity politics, or it's like a separate thing from the class struggle because it's migrant rights. Separate. It's not separate. It's central. Like the central axis of class struggle in the United States today is precisely around the question of immigration.
Yeah.
Right? That's a central axis of class struggles. Yeah. Just as it was when we had the Black Lives Matter uprising against the police. Right? The police are a force of capitalist power, not just of racial power, but of capitalist power. So we're fighting both at the same time. Right?
Yeah.
And that is where we have a kind of intellectual failure of the white left to see the struggles that are already happening and which they are excluding themselves from because of intellectual mistakes in their analysis, essentially.
I mean, I think one example here in Germany is in the 90s when the Berlin Wall came down, like the early 90s, like the 80s, when the Berlin Wall came down, basically, you had the trade unions like consciously kicking out or like not accepting or like not protecting the guest workers, like the Turkish workers, or the Turkish from the southern workers, kicking them out, so that you can replace them with Eastern German workers.
Right.
And this was a common. There's even, like, I don't speak German, but like there's a phrase that they use. Like it's a common thing that they did, which is sell down basically the racialized labor that you mentioned.
Right.
And then obviously when you have that, the racialized labor, because they can no longer rely on, this union force or this white union force or whatever, because it doesn't have a meaningful understanding of race. They create their own communities. And then later on, when these communities sort of gain power and so on and so forth, they're classified as like identity politics.
Right.
Which is really sinister in reality, and in my opinion, I think.
Right.
Yeah, but I think,
and if you've spent, just on that quickly as well, if you're a left-wing organization that has spent decades organizing the working class as a white working class, you can hardly be surprised when the far right come along and start saying, oh yeah, we'll now advocate for the white working class and emphasize their whiteness as much as their working class part, right? So they've given opportunities to our political enemies, right? And that was entirely predictable. No one should be surprised that that's the outcome.
Yeah, I'm going on that note. I think one of the last questions, or one of the last questions I want to ask you, which is, I think, a very important point that you end the book with. I think something that, at least in my organizing here, I've been thinking about, and I think you've put it into words, what you just said, which relates to what you just said, which is, if you focus too much, I mean, I don't think that any left would say like we're focusing on specifically the white working class, but or maybe today they would, but specifically they would say, for example, we need to get back to our groove. We need to get back to like the post-war years, and we need to get back to like what we've gained. And what you mentioned, I think, at least how I interpret what you're writing, is that basically, if you like remove race from that analysis, like the basically the racialization that was required in order for you to have the privileges of the union contracts after the war, if you remove which the left has, if you remove race, then you can easily see how like the violence of neoliberalism has managed to seep its way through that under theorized, or like the racial thing, like where someone like, I think you mentioned like Enoch Powell, where someone like Enoch Powell can come and say something extremely racist, and it just becomes adopted because you have under theorized that race. And I feel like the left today, especially in the unions, want to go back to like this reform years, not knowing that it's not a coincidence that we're under neoliberalism, but it's because of the lack of racial understanding race and class that brought us here. That's what I said, a long question, so to speak, but and this is something I find absolutely fascinating in your final remarks in the book.
Well, I think that there's certainly been a kind of nostalgia politics, right? In how we've understood neoliberalism on the left, right? So we see it as this regression from the social achievements after World War II. That this regression that begins in the 1970s, and so then we want a nostalgia to go back, right, to before the 1970s, when this counter-revolution kicked in. And part of the problem with that is if you look at the situation, if you take Britain, when Britain created what they call the cradle to grave welfare state after World War II, Britain was an empire, right? So it's still, in 1945, most of the people that were governed from that government in London didn't live in the British Isles. They lived in Jamaica and Trinidad and Guyana and the Indian subcontinent. And and Nigeria and Kenya and Uganda and so on, right? And so the welfare state, from that perspective, then looks like a narrow sphere of white privilege, right? For some of the people governed from London, right? For a tiny minority, in fact, of people governed from London, while the others don't have healthcare and unemployment benefit and pensions and so on. And when those people in those parts of the world start organizing themselves to try and get those things, their civil and political rights are violated, and Britain sends in the military to suppress them, right? I mean, they literally sent in gunships to Caribbean islands when those people in the Caribbean started talking about wanting the same human surveillance, right?
Yeah.
No doubt, right? No doubt. So that's what colonialism is, right? Precisely what colonialism is. It's a system of segregation to allow your people at home to have certain rights that your people abroad don't have, so that you can exploit those people in the rest of the world to a greater extent than you exploit the people at home, stabilizing the whole system, right? That's what it's about. Now, neoliberalism is a way of trying to find new ways to use race to stabilize the world system once you no longer have the formal European empires that you used to have.
Yeah.
Right? How does it do that? It says, okay, well, a country like Trinidad is going to be independent formally, right? It's going to have its own government. We need to set up a global economic system that means that its economic policies aren't actually sovereign. So its people don't get to actually dictate its economic policies. Those are dictated by a global financial system, and the people of Trinidad have no veto over that. And so that the Trinidadians can fly their own flag over their government buildings, but the sovereignty is symbolic, right? And that was what so central to neoliberalism. And if you look at the neoliberal thinkers, right through the century, that is the major theme of what they're thinking about. They're not just thinking about class; they're thinking about race and colonialism as much as well, right? They see all of those things as linked together, right? They're much more willing to think about race and class simultaneously than the white leftists, right? So the nostalgia politics will never be sufficient to defeat neoliberalism. Even if we didn't care about the fact that the model is a colonial model. Actually, just from a practical point of view, you're not going to win against neoliberalism unless you can do this more difficult thinking of saying, how do we have to think about the question of imperialism within the question of neoliberalism, right? And if we're thinking about Europe today, we have to think about how the struggles of the mainstream white citizen working class of Europe, how those struggles coordinate with the struggles of people, some of the victims of imperialism, the victims of neocolonialism, some of whom come to Europe, but others who don't. Right? Mm-hmm. One of the things neoliberalism does is turns millions and millions of people around the world into surplus, what I call surplus population. In other words, they're not. There's no prospect for those people of entering the kind of relationship to capitalism that you think of when you think of the working class, the industrial worker, right? Exploited in the ways that Marx writes about in Capital Volume 1, right? They don't get that opportunity even for that kind of exploitation. Their relationship to capitalism is one of abandonment, right? And so the struggles are going to look different from the struggles that Marx theorizes, right? And the question is, how do we coordinate these various different kinds of class struggle, right? Rather than try and say, as the white left tends to do, oh, well, in the end, they all have to follow our tradition, right, of how class struggle has looked to them in Europe, right? That's the political challenge for us today, is to imagine how these different kinds of struggle can be coordinated in ways where they come together to defeat this common enemy of the global capitalist system.
Which is I don't know. It's a very difficult task, I think, especially to I don't know, destroy or collapse this nostalgia of like a past, that was all privileged certain workers over others. I think this is a very complicated thing, and I think I'm not yet sure like if some elements of the left are ready to like just give that up already. So I do agree that it is difficult today. But yeah, I think with that, and I think for everyone who's listening, there's an interesting part in the book we haven't gone to, but where you talk about how there is sort of non-capitalist forms of reproduction and labor and stuff like that also is required for capitalist forms of reproduction and stuff like this. This is very interesting. You can find all of that and more in the book. It is really, really thought-provoking. It's really, really interesting. And thank you so much for being with us, and thank you so much for your words. And yeah, like I say this a lot, but I hope we have you on some time later on. And it's been really wonderful for me, and I've learned a lot. And yeah, I hope we can be in contact, and we see what comes next.
Certainly, it's great talking to you, and good to be in touch with you in the future. Thanks for having me.
No problem.
Thanks. Good. Down. Thanks. Travel. That's just Gerber. You go. That's right. Deep. Not far that. Absolutely. That's right. You go. And that's right. Good. You go. Deep. That's great. Wow. Toy. But it's your work to first. Edward 6. Deep. Not wrong. 6. Word. Edward 6. Just take some love. That's good. Bad. Just plus. Best. Yeah.
Almost.